For nearly 700 years, the most powerful army the ancient world had ever seen tried again and again to break through a single frontier. And every single time it failed. So what was it about this one stretch of land, and the people who defended it, that stopped legion after legion, emperor after emperor, in a way that Gaul, Egypt, and half the known world never could? And to understand that mystery, we have to travel back to a moment when Rome was already the master of the Mediterranean, flush with conquest, hungry for more glory, and utterly convinced that the East would fall just as easily as the West had. Because by the middle of the 1st century BC, Rome had swallowed up Spain, Gaul, Greece, and much of North Africa, and its generals had grown used to the idea that resistance was only ever a matter of time. Yet across the Euphrates River lay a civilization that Roman commanders badly misjudged, the Parthian Empire, heirs to the old Persian tradition and rulers of a vast territory stretching from Mesopotamia into what is now Iran. And this was not some loose collection of desert tribes waiting to be steamrolled. It was a sophisticated, wealthy, and militarily inventive state that controlled the lucrative trade routes linking Rome to India and China. And it is here that our story truly begins. With a Roman politician named Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man whose fortune was legendary, but whose reputation as a soldier lagged far behind his rivals Pompey and Julius Caesar. And driven by envy and ambition, Crassus set his sights on Parthia in 53 BC, hoping that a swift eastern conquest would finally cement his place among Rome's greatest commanders. So he marched into Mesopotamia at the head of roughly 40,000 men, a force that on paper looked unstoppable. But what awaited him near the town of Carrhae would become one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman military history, and many historians believe this single battle set the tone for centuries of Roman frustration in the East, because the Parthian commander, a nobleman known as Shurna, understood something that Roman generals consistently underestimated, that the wide open plains of Mesopotamia were not suited to the heavy infantry tactics that had won Rome its European conquests. Instead, Shurna built his force around two devastating elements: armored cataphracts, riders and horses both encased in metal, capable of smashing through infantry lines like a battering ram, and swarms of lightly armored horse archers, mounted on swift steppe horses bred for endurance and speed. And it was these horse archers who delivered the killing blow, using a technique that would haunt Roman memory for generations, riding close enough to loose devastating volleys of arrows, then retreating just out of reach, only to turn in the saddle and fire backward at their pursuers, a maneuver so effective it earned its own name, the Parthian shot. And Crassus's legions, trained for disciplined melee combat, found themselves trapped in the open desert with no cavalry of their own to counter the threat, surrounded, exhausted, and repeatedly pierced by arrows that seemed to have an endless supply, thanks to a brilliantly organized camel train resupplying the archers throughout the battle. And by the time the dust settled, an estimated 20,000 Roman soldiers lay dead, 10,000 more had been captured, and Crassus himself was killed, with later Roman writers claiming, though this remains debated among historians, that molten gold was poured down his throat as a symbol of his greed, and the legendary silver eagle standards of several legions were lost, a humiliation that stung the Roman psyche for decades. So why does this matter so much to the larger story? Because Carrhae was not simply a single lost battle. It exposed a fundamental military mismatch that Rome would never fully solve. The Roman war machine was built for infantry supremacy, for sieges, for grinding attrition against opponents who eventually stood and fought. But the Iranian plateau and its approaches offered something else entirely: vast distances, extreme heat, few reliable water sources, and an enemy whose entire strategy revolved around speed, mobility, and denying the Romans a decisive infantry engagement. And this lesson, as painful as it was, did not stop Rome from trying again, because roughly 2 decades later, Mark Antony, then at the height of his power and partnered with Cleopatra of Egypt, launched his own invasion of Parthian territory in 36 BC, hoping to succeed where Crassus had failed, and initially his campaign seemed promising. Marching a massive army toward the Parthian vassal kingdom of Media Atropatene in search of a decisive victory. But logistics again proved to be Rome's undoing. Antony's siege train, carrying the heavy equipment needed to break through fortified cities, was separated from the main force and destroyed by Parthian cavalry, leaving his army without the tools to capture key strongholds. And as the campaign dragged on, disease, starvation, and repeated harassment by Parthian horse archers forced a brutal retreat through hostile territory, with some ancient sources suggesting Antony lost over a third of his men before finally reaching safety. And once again, the pattern repeated itself. Rome's strength on the battlefield meant little when the terrain and climate themselves became the enemy's greatest allies, and it would take Rome nearly a century and a half to attempt anything resembling a full-scale invasion again. Though tensions and smaller conflicts simmered throughout, with both empires frequently clashing over control of the buffer kingdom of Armenia, a strategically vital region that sat between them like a contested chess piece. And this brings us to one of the most curious aspects of this century's long rivalry, that despite all the bloodshed, neither side ever fully conquered the other. And some historians argue this was not purely due to military failure, but also because both empires, at various points, found more value in controlled trade and diplomacy than in total war, since the Silk Road routes running through Parthian and later Persian territory were an enormous source of wealth, and outright annihilation of the other power risked destabilizing a profitable arrangement. But ambition, as it so often does in history, eventually overrode caution, and in 114 AD, the Emperor Trajan, fresh off his celebrated conquest of Dacia and eager to outdo Alexander the Great himself, launched the most successful Roman invasion of the Parthian heartland the empire would ever achieve, sweeping through Armenia, then Mesopotamia, and remarkably capturing the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon itself, a city near modern-day Baghdad. And for a brief, glittering moment, it seemed as though Rome had finally done what Crassus and Antony could not. Trajan even reportedly stood on the shores of the Persian Gulf, gazing toward India, lamenting that he was too old to press further east the way Alexander once had. But this triumph proved to be dangerously fragile, because holding vast, newly conquered territory populated by people with no loyalty to Rome turned out to be far harder than winning it, and widespread revolts erupted almost immediately across the newly claimed provinces, forcing Trajan to divert his forces into brutal counter-insurgency campaigns instead of consolidation. And before the situation could stabilize, Trajan fell ill and died in 117 AD, and his successor Hadrian, a far more cautious and pragmatic ruler, made the decisive choice to abandon nearly all of the eastern conquests, withdrawing Roman forces back to the traditional Euphrates frontier. And this decision reveals something crucial about the entire Roman-Iranian rivalry, that even when Rome achieved genuine military victory, the sheer scale, distance, and instability of the region made permanent occupation almost impossible to sustain. And historical evidence suggests that Hadrian understood this reality better than most, recognizing that an overextended empire chasing glory in distant deserts was far more vulnerable than a strong, well-defended frontier. And this pattern of temporary conquest followed by strategic withdrawal would repeat itself again under later emperors, including Lucius Verus in the 160s AD, whose generals sacked Ctesiphon once more, and Septimius Severus at the turn of the 3rd century, who also captured the Parthian capital. Yet in both cases, the same fundamental problems resurfaced. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin, disease ravaged Roman camps in the unfamiliar climate, and local populations remained fiercely resistant to permanent Roman administration. And then in 224 AD, the entire political landscape of the region transformed dramatically when a Persian nobleman named Ardashir I overthrew the weakened Parthian dynasty and established the Sassanid Empire, a new Persian state that consciously modeled itself on the glory of the ancient Achaemenid kings, Cyrus and Darius. And this shift mattered enormously, because the Sassanids brought renewed centralization, religious zeal rooted in Zoroastrianism, and a far more aggressive military posture than the Parthians had maintained in their later, more fractured years. And Rome, rather than facing a weakened rival, now confronted a reinvigorated Persian state determined to reclaim what it saw as its rightful ancient territories. And the clashes that followed were often catastrophic for Rome, none more so than the disaster that befell the Emperor Valerian in 260 AD, who, after suffering defeat at the Battle of Edessa against the formidable Sassanid King Shapur I, made the fateful decision to negotiate in person, only to be captured, an almost unthinkable humiliation, a reigning Roman emperor taken prisoner by a foreign power. And according to later Persian tradition, though the details remain debated among historians, Valerian spent his remaining years in captivity, and some accounts, likely exaggerated for propaganda purposes, even claim Shapur used him as a human footstool when mounting his horse, and whether or not every detail of that story is accurate, the symbolic message carved into Sassanid rock reliefs celebrating the victory was unmistakable. Persia was not simply resisting Rome, it was humiliating it on the world stage. And this era firmly established what would become the defining characteristic of the entire conflict, that this was not a rivalry Rome could simply outmuscle. Because Sassanid Persia matched Roman engineering with its own sophisticated fortifications, matched Roman legions with elite armored cavalry units that some historians believe directly influenced later European knights, and matched Roman administrative complexity with a deeply organized bureaucratic state of its own. And this leads us to perhaps the most symbolically important failure of them all, the campaign of Emperor Julian, known to history as Julian the Apostate. In 363 AD, a brilliant, ambitious ruler determined to restore Rome's fading eastern glory, and Julian's invasion initially achieved remarkable success, advancing deep into Persian territory and even reaching the walls of Ctesiphon itself. Yet in a decision that would prove fatal, he chose not to besiege the heavily fortified capital, and instead began a retreat back toward Roman territory. A retreat that turned disastrous when Persian forces harassed his exposed columns relentlessly. And during one such skirmish, Julian was struck by a spear, some accounts suggest thrown by his own frustrated troops, though most historical evidence points toward a Persian soldier, and he died shortly afterward, becoming the last Roman emperor to personally lead an invasion into the Iranian heartland. And his death effectively marked the end of any serious Roman ambition to permanently conquer Persian territory. And after Julian, the following 2.5 centuries settled into an exhausting, grinding stalemate, punctuated by periodic wars, temporary truces, and shifting control over border fortresses and the ever-contested kingdom of Armenia. And many historians argue that this prolonged conflict, often called one of history's longest-running rivalries between great powers, ultimately weakened both civilizations far more than it strengthened either one, draining treasuries, exhausting armies, and diverting resources that might otherwise have gone toward internal stability. And this exhaustion became catastrophically clear in the early 7th century, when the Byzantine Empire, Rome's eastern successor state, and the Sassanid Persian Empire fought their final, most devastating war against one another. A brutal conflict lasting over 2 decades that saw both empires reach the very edge of collapse, with Persian forces at one point advancing all the way to the walls of Constantinople itself, and Byzantine forces later striking deep into the Persian heartland in a stunning reversal under Emperor Heraclius. And while the Byzantines ultimately emerged nominally victorious, both empires were left so thoroughly devastated, their armies so depleted, their treasuries so empty, that neither had the strength left to resist what came next. And it is here that history delivers one of its most striking ironies, because within just a few short years, a new and unexpected force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, the armies of the early Islamic Caliphate, and this rising power swept through both exhausted empires with startling speed, permanently ending the Sassanid Persian Empire entirely by the mid-7th century, and stripping the Byzantines of their wealthiest eastern provinces. And so, in the end, after nearly 700 years of war, invasion, humiliation, and temporary triumph, Rome never conquered Iran, not because its legions lacked courage, and not because its emperors lacked ambition, but because the vast distances, the harsh desert climate, the brilliant horse archer tactics pioneered at Carrhae and refined for centuries afterward, and the deeply rooted resilience of Persian civilization itself, combined again and again to make permanent conquest essentially impossible. And perhaps the greatest lesson buried within this long history is one that echoes far beyond antiquity, that raw military power alone has rarely been enough to control a land whose geography, culture, and people refuse to be tamed by force. And this ancient rivalry between Rome and Iran, between West and East, would go on to shape centuries of subsequent history, influencing everything from later Byzantine-Persian relations to the very geopolitical patterns that continue to define this region today. And so the next time you hear about tension along this same ancient frontier, remember that you are witnessing echoes of a story nearly 2,000 years in the making, one where the desert itself and the people who mastered it proved mightier than the most powerful army the ancient world had ever known. And if you found this hidden chapter of history as fascinating as we did, make sure to like this video. Subscribe for more deep dives into the empires and battles that shaped our world. And let us know in the comments which ancient rivalry you would like us to explore next.